Welcome to Model Minority Moms, where we talk about the meaning of success in career, family, and life. We are Jeanette Park,
Kate Wong, and Susan Liu.
Harvard classmates and Asian American working moms who get real about the pressures of fitting in while standing out.
Greetings, and welcome to another episode of Model Minority Moms. Oh man, we've got a good guest today. Do you ever have issues with spending money? Do you ever feel like, I need this, but I can't buy this? Or actually, I can't afford this and I'm going to buy this? If the answer is yes, we are so excited to have Shang Saavedra onto our podcast. She's the author of a newly released book called Wealth is a Mindset. And at 31 years old, everyone listen, 31, Shang finished saving for retirement, achieving her fire plan with her husband, and was living a work optional life. At 31, I didn't even have a real job yet. This woman's incredible. She has coached over 200 households into a dignified retirement and has taught over 8,000 individuals how to achieve financial freedom through her courses. She was named by Time Next Advisor as one of the 25 most influential new voices of money, has been featured on Forbes and USA Today, went to Harvard College. Yes, she's actually our classmate, and has an MBA from University of Chicago Booth. Her approach is really specific and I think so important to our listeners because she is crystal clear that if you want to achieve your financial goals, you have to tie your mental health and your financial wealth together. Shang, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. So I'm so excited and proud of you. I read through the introduction. I was sitting there going like, I did not know any of this about you. I can't wait to share you with our listeners because your journey to achieving financial freedom, what you witnessed as a kid, what you were trying to prove to yourself and to the rest of the world and then unprove is truly inspirational. So, could you just share with our listeners a little bit more about your ethnic background, a little bit of your upbringing, where your parents came from?
Sure thing. So I'm Chinese American. I was born in China, actually, and my parents and I moved around a lot when I was a little kid. Very typical immigrant story. My dad basically, through his professor career, moved us from China to Switzerland to Netherlands to the United States. And within each of these countries, we moved around a lot to find housing. So before I was 10 years old, I probably had lived in 10 different dwellings, houses, apartments of the kind. And by the time that I arrived in the United States, I'd already been through a lot of transitions in schools as well, where I was the newbie. I was the only non white looking kid in the class because Europe at that time was not very, very diverse. And I was also small in stature due to some nutritional things that happened when I was younger. And I had some deformities to my face. And so growing up, I was the subject of a lot of bullying. And I would say that a lot of the things that I did financially, career wise, was to prove my bullies wrong. Like I literally wrote, and I talk about this in my book, I wrote what I call the Shang High School Manifesto, where I was like, I'm going to prove everybody that I'm not one to be bullied, that you're going to see what I'm made of. And that drove me to get, into Harvard College like you guys, to do well in school, to try to get as high paying a job as possible, to go on what I had hoped to be a career that would maybe lead to the C-suite one day. That was the original dream, to be written about in magazines and celebrated. And along the way, I met my husband at business school. And actually, one thing that he brought up really changed my mindset around all of this. And I had been, saving and investing a lot of my money. But with my husband together, we focused on not just building a lot of money, but rather building freedom into our lives. And introduction to the book writes about that about face and how all of that changed.
Yeah, and now before we get into the nuts and bolts and the how, I want to actually hit rewind and go back to your early childhood because you're like, and then my dad was a professor and we were traveling around the world. Okay, wait. He was growing up in China during the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
And for him to actually get into a good college, he tested number 1 out of 10 million students.
It's
Right?
mind-boggling how crazy an achievement that was.
Yeah. And give me a little bit more context about the Cultural Revolution at the time and how that impacted your family.
Yeah. So, Cultural Revolution, for those who are not familiar, was when the Communist Party of China came into power, and they basically did a cleanse across the country of anybody they deemed to be a threat to communism. This is primarily the intelligentsia, the people who had money, and then for the rest, the average everyday people, um, they were encouraged to just, uphold communism through being great farmers. So all the schools were closed. My parents, for I think several years, did not attend school. Instead, they were part of the teenage crowd that were sent across the country to rural farming areas to farm and make a living that way. But my dad, oh my goodness, he wanted better than this. He dreamed of escaping all of this, and he studied in secret with a couple of teachers that he had befriended. And when the Cultural Revolution ended and the education system in China reopened, and it's a testing system, so to determine what college you go to, it's purely by a quantitative test. He took those college entrance exams. And back then, they write out your name, your grade, or like your test score, and that basically determines what school you go to. And he remember walking into the hall where they released the scores, and this was I don't even know it was printed. It might have even been hand printed, handwritten. He couldn't find his name. He's like, "Where's my name? Where's my name?" And somebody nudged him who knew his name. They're like, "Look at the top. You're number 1. You get to go to any school of your dreams." And he picked Tsinghua University, which is essentially the MIT equivalent in China.
Incredible.
Just as a side note, I mean, I think just like through having guests, but then also learning about Kate's parents, just like actually a lot of Chinese American um, people of our generation, especially like ones who maybe variously have some kind of Harvard or Harvard adjacent connection, because that's a lot of our guests. Like actually a lot of their parents are of this generation. I'm actually realizing their
Yeah.
parents went through the Cultural Revolution, and then they were either the first class or one of the first few classes to be able to come back to school, and just like that crazy experience. Like that's something I never, I mean, it makes sense like mathematically, like and timing wise, but it's become much more salient to me, like how common that experience is just for our generation, people who are Chinese American. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, I noticed that all my parents' friends went through the same thing, and then so, like, this whole generation of my making friends with their kids, it's like, yeah, all our parents went through that, so it seemed normal, but then now I think back on it, it's actually not that normal at all.
So your father excels at school and eventually leaves China after you're born, and you're in China without your parents until you're 3.
Yeah. Separation anxiety,
What was
dude.
the I was like, "Wait, why?" Like,
Um, and I hear this is actually quite common too amongst people of that generation. Upon graduating from undergrad, my dad wanted to go on to graduate studies, but because the Communist Party kind of destroyed everything, they didn't have enough of an infrastructure to teach graduate level studies. So, for an interesting period of time, all of the scholars, the top scholars from China, were encouraged to actually leave the country and study elsewhere. So, my dad finished his PhD in the Netherlands, and that was when I was still in China, then his postdoc in Switzerland, and on to professorship. And because they felt that they couldn't afford to bring me, they left me with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, back in China, and I grew up for 3 years without them.
so eventually they come for you. One person comes for you. You don't even have a winter coat, and then they bring you to, is it America?
The first stop we landed was temporarily in the Netherlands, but then my dad was in process of getting the papers, I guess, ready, and I don't remember fully what happened. But I know we landed in the Netherlands. I got a giant, way too big for me winter coat, and then we moved to Switzerland soon after, and was were there for about 2.5 years.
And you mentioned, you talk about this a little bit in your book, but do you have memories of that time you were in the Netherlands and Switzerland? It like you said, Europe at the time. was very, very white, maybe even more so than some parts of the United States. And also, it's, culturally, obviously very different. Do you have memories of that time? I'm just really curious. Any
Yeah.
salient memories?
Oh my goodness, first day of kindergarten, Switzerland. Didn't understand a word the teacher was saying because I didn't know Swiss German. Like, my parents literally took me from a Chinese-speaking country, dropped me in Europe, and then expected me to go to school. I was like, I don't know what they were thinking, and I had no friends, nobody to speak Swiss German to. I remember it was circle time, and the teacher passed around a cup of what I later found out was soapy water with a straw in it, and she was teaching all the children that you can make bubbles. So you blow into the straw. But
Oh,
I,
I
of
see what
course,
it is.
didn't understand the instruction. So when the cup passed to me, and this is so gross because everyone's blowing into the same straw, I drank the soapy water and I cried. And that was the end of
Oh,
my first school
man.
day. They called my mom and had me taken home because I think I was so traumatized by the whole thing. And there were multiple memories like this because every time my parents moved, it was very sudden. I didn't have a chance to learn a new language. So every time I went into a new school, I had some cultural misunderstanding. I think first day of school in the Netherlands, kids just came up to me and like, because now we can show video. They did this with their eyes. They're like, "Why are your eyes so tiny? Like, where are you from? Who are you? Ching chang chong." And that was my first time experiencing, oh, I am an other person. Like, I don't belong here. And this just kept going. It was actually wasn't until moving to the US where I felt like some of that racial separation stopped being so prominent in my life.
Oh my god. Okay, I'm gonna speed you up. We're in America now, and are you're competing with other kids to be the best academically, the best with piano, and you get a lot of pressure from your parents to go to Harvard or MIT. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. We landed in a suburb called Lexington, Massachusetts. And for those who don't know, Lexington, Massachusetts is a pressure cooker suburb. Most people there came from well to do families, plenty of professor families moved to Lexington. It's a very well known public system. So it's on par with private schools in terms of their focus on education. And my parents, having had the opportunity to leave China because of my dad's love of education, they're like, well, that's going to be the path for Shang. And we only have one chance because she's our only child. We're not going to have any more. And so the pressure was on me to succeed. I was basically told from a very young age, don't come home with anything less than 100 or there'll be severe consequences. Although I never really, stuck around to figure out what those were because I just did not dare to do that. And for piano, well, I actually ended up liking piano. It started out as a forced hobby, but I ended up liking it. And perhaps I inherited some of my dad's competitive edge. And so it just got stuck in my mind very early to just be the best at everything. And I think the bullying that I experienced as a young child just piled on top of that. It's like, okay, if you can't win socially, if you're not going to be popular, then might as well be the best at something that you are good at, which would be academics and piano.
Mhm. This all sounds very familiar, maybe in a different variation for me. I was also not allowed to bring home anything other than 100. I did actually see consequences of that, which were not very pleasant because sometimes you can't always get a 100, right? What if it's like a
Yeah.
90? I literally brought home like a 96 one time and I got, yeah, I was punished, right? And so I totally, all
Yeah.
this, I think what Shung is saying resonates, right? And then you feel like like you just don't fit in. Also, I'm sure, I don't know, do you feel like you were a social kid, like whether at school or with other Chinese? Families, kids, or did you just kind of, like, really double
Yeah.
down only on
Well,
school?
thankfully, Lexington did have Asian students. Now, it was split at that time between the established Taiwanese families and the newcomer Chinese mainlanders. There was a stark difference
Mm,
that I quickly learned because I went to the local church. That was all Taiwanese. There apparently were several Taiwanese families that had settled in the 80s all around the same time. And so they all knew each other. These were all the popular Taiwanese Americans. And then me and a couple of other who later became some of my best friends, we were the newcomer mainland Chinese people, and I think our parents put greater levels of pressure on academic achievement on us compared to the Taiwanese American parents. But even amongst my Chinese American friends, my parents stood out as the craziest bunch. And yes, to your point, Kate, when in high school I started dropping below the 100 average, there were punishments included not getting to eat like my favorite things. Like that was I thought that was really cruel taking the power cord away from my desktop computer. And there were no laptops at that
What?
point.
Oh, that's new. I
Yeah,
haven't heard that one.
I
Your
needed my
parents
computer
get a
to do
prize for that
work,
one.
to do homework, so I actually ended up having to
Yeah.
stay at my high school library or go to school earlier to do my homework because there was no other way for me to have computer access. I thought because they thought I was doing too much chatting online with my friends. And then other punishments, I really this is digging into my trauma, but I remember, yeah, being grounded, even though I didn't even have a car, so there's not much to being grounded. Just come home and yeah, maybe they even listened in on my phone conversations with friends. I bet they did some of that too. So
I feel like, you should see everybody. I wish you could see Susan's face right now. It was just kind of like, this all kind of makes me feel like, and I don't want to spoil your book for other people, but this story and this path of yours, it's almost like y- it almost feels a little bit like a hero's journey, except like Chinese American, I know Asian immigrant style, where there were so many factors isolating you, right? Like you were ostracized by your peers, and then your parents were very punishment oriented, like many of our parents at the time. And so it almost feels like I feel like you're kind of, if I were to imagine you, you were like this little figure alone in this world where you're just kind of trying to like push through with all these currents, right? Just like
yeah,
battering you.
my
And I
diary
wonder
was
if,
my best friend. I actually kept all my childhood diaries. I refused to read them for years, but in writing my book, I unearthed them. And the writing style is so profoundly different than my personality today. It was depressing, really sad, and extremely lonely. And on top of that,
mm,
very critical of myself because I learned the only thing I learned from my parents at that time was if you're not perfect, you punish yourself. So anytime I felt like I wasn't perfect or I said something stupid in class. I remember writing down, "Oh, I shouldn't have played that particular note during this piano competition. I don't think I'm going to win." And then later I found out that I did win something. But I never found
mm.
myself celebrating my achievements. I was just always like, I did this wrong. I didn't get 100 this time. I'm worried about what my parents are going to think. And then all the typical teenage angst on top of that, having crushes on people. But yeah, it was really sad to read my journal during that time.
And so I remember it was you or Susan in or like in the beginning of this recording was saying, oh, you were saying that in high school you kind of decided that you wanted to like be at the top, right? You sort of like
My
the
manifesto.
beginnings of maybe this sort of ambition. Yeah, exactly. Your manifesto started at this time. Can you talk a little bit more about how that came to be and like just maybe just your story and how it kind of pushed you ultimately in the direction that you went? Because I think that's a big important part of how you got started on this journey, of this like,
Yeah.
financial journey. Yeah.
I mean, through perhaps the books that I read, because I read a lot of biographies and autobiographies, and maybe some of the, stuff that I see on TV, I began to realize in middle school and high school that if you studied well, you could do really cool things later on in life and career. And because clearly my kind of outcome in life to that point had been the outcast, the unpopular person, the person that everybody made fun of, I was like, you know what? Not going to win when it comes to the popularity contest. So why don't I focus on this stuff? Because it looks like it could actually work out. And I do like the idea of being accomplished. Being rich was kind of secondary. It was more like being accomplished that I really focused on. And so when I had written down my high school manifesto, I think I literally said things like, I will make it. I will get into Harvard. I'm going to show everybody wrong. I'm going to prove to them that I'm better than them. I think there's this sense of, okay, if you make me feel small, I'm going to feel bigger than you. I dreamed of this like ultimate revenge scenario in my head where I would come back to the high school reunion, be like, ha ha, I beat all of you guys. And so then the achievement at school made sense. I was like, yeah, it makes sense. You need to get high grades. You need to do a bunch of extracurriculars. So strategically, I chose to be the yearbook editor in chief only because I wasn't good enough at math or science to be on the math and science team. So I was like, I'm going to pick something else where I'm going to be number one. So that was yearbook. And that's where my photography skills first started developing. And I like, yeah, just started reverse engineering what it took to get into an Ivy League school. I was gifted the book, I think 50 successful Harvard essays. So I read that book and
Oh,
reverse
yeah.
engineered the 5 ways that you could write a Harvard entrance essay. So that was important. The only thing I didn't know how to do were the interviews. So I'm like glad I made it through my college admissions interviews because they were a complete disaster in retrospect. And just waited and waited on pins and needles to see if I would get in. Didn't get into Harvard or MIT during early action. So that was like crushing. And I was like, there's nothing else I could do at this point. Okay, just keep waiting. And then April came and got all the admissions. And it was just like it felt like years of it felt validating. Like, yeah, I think all of us
Mm,
understand like getting into a top school feels extremely validating. And then continuing into Harvard kind of applied the same mindset. Okay, I joined the Harvard Crimson Board. Harvard Crimson is our newspaper, and the business board is where most people who want to do business work out. Most of us didn't care much about journalism at all. We just wanted to make money. And the Harvard Crimson Business Board alumni went into investment banking and management consulting, which at that time were the top 2 exit options for people
mm.
studying economics at Harvard. And so very, very early on, I was like, okay, came in as a freshman. I'm going to exit into either iBanking or management consulting, and then just kind of built up my entire experience in Harvard that way, got into management consulting, and then so on and so forth.
Okay, wait. I want you to press pause and rewind one more time, but like a half rewind, which
Yeah.
is when you're applying to college, you said in your intro in your book, you always thought your family was low income
Yeah.
because your dad bought like a no name brand car, which I was like, what brand is it? And it was like
It
a
doesn't
different
even
color, so
exist
it was like
anymore.
discounted. What was it, like a Datsun? Like what
It's
was
called
it?
Doesn't.
a
Was
Was
it a Datsun?
Geo Metro. You'll have to Google because yeah, yeah, literally. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah, it
It's a
doesn't exist
complete
anymore.
clunker.
Um,
Yeah.
So
I
he
thought we
got
were
that,
poor.
and then your mom was always clipping coupons, and then your dad comes up to you and says, "You don't need to fill out a
Yeah.
FAFSA for
Yeah.
financial aid because I've been saving for you, and we actually have everything."
Yeah. Mind blowing. But
What
also, I
was
was like,
what was
kind of
your
bad timing
reaction to
that
that? Because you thought you were poor.
I was so convinced we were poor. Lexington is a very expensive place to live in. Even at that time, now I can't. I bet everything like multi-million dollars at this point. We literally lived one street away from being out of the district. Like I know we were edge of town on like a really bad plot. The road we had was unpaved because all our neighbors didn't want to. It was a private road. Small house, no name cars, awfully bright colors. One of them was blue, the other one's bright, neon bright green. And so no eating out. And I did have some exposure to rich kids because I went to a music school on the weekends, and that's where all the private school kids showed up. And they
Mm.
talked about international vacations every break. I was like, who does that? And then they can go to these like music camps that cost thousands of dollars. And I was like, who can afford that? And they always had nice shoes. Like that was something that I remember. Beautiful shoes. I was like, okay, I'm not them. So I'm kind of, and my parents being very immigrant parents and trying to encourage me to study, they would always talk about when I was your age, I had to walk up hills both ways and I had no food. Remember the Cultural Revolution? We only had 1 pound of meat. So they had just drilled it into my head, like, or like made me so fully convinced that we were just like not having enough money. I knew we weren't like poor because we're in the streets, but I was like, I don't think we're well off at all. So, and they kept saying, you
Mm.
got to pay for school. You're going to have to apply for scholarships. So I went through scholarship books to try to figure out how to apply for scholarships. And then after all of that, like my dad chose a really bad time, which was in the middle of the stress of applying for schools. He's like, "Oh, by the way, I'm not going to fill out the FAFSA because you don't need it." I was like, "What? Okay, but I got to apply. Okay, we'll talk about it later." So I don't think I ever got to process that either. I just kept applying and going. And it's like,
Mm.
okay, great. Thanks, Dad. That's awesome. And I think it took me many years. I think it wasn't until my own coaching clients, they're like, Shang, you had your college fully paid for. Do you realize how rare that was? I was like, huh, okay, I guess that is. Because I didn't even think about it at the time.
Hmm, interesting. Just such a because your family grew up talking about money pretty openly.
Hmm. But it was kind of like gossip to them.
What yeah. Well, I wanna dig into that more because that's actually one of my questions about, like, why we feel so taboo about money, like, because I think from the outside, Shang, it's like I kind of my understanding from reading your book is like there was an openness, I think, in some ways, like in terms of talking about like, oh well, who's did what, who got which job,
Yeah.
right? Like that kind of talk. But like on the other hand, like for example, you didn't know that your dad had saved up enough to send you to college debt free, right? Like so in
Yeah,
some ways like you didn't actually have complete transparency into like your family's financial situation and what your how your parents were prioritizing spending and saving and all of that, right? And so I'm very I wanna dive into that, like, a little bit deeper, but maybe later in the conversation because I think it's so interesting also because, like, being married to somebody who's not Asian, who's white, right? Like, I feel like I also have a glimpse into yet another different kind of, like, cultural norms around
yeah,
money and talking or not talking about money, and but I wanna put that in the parking lot for a second.
for sure. Yeah, money was talked
All right.
about, but the amount of wealth my parents had was not discussed. So,
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So you go to Harvard.
Ugh.
Y the badge to get is iBanking or management consultant. Everyone knew it, you know?
mhm,
And then you graduate doing management consulting.
yeah,
Yeah. So then take us from there to meeting your husband at Booth. Like what's going on for you? Are you like living this like beautiful life of like all the like heels you've ever wanted? Like are you spending extravagantly because you're like I have money, or are you actually frugal then, or help
yeah.
me understand?
So to Jeanette's point, my parents made it a point to kind of make money almost like an adulting skill that I had to learn along with cooking and cleaning and hygiene and all of that stuff. So my dad in particular normalized you need to keep a budget and you need to stay debt free. And he actually taught me how that he set up a custodial Roth IRA. We can talk about that a little bit later. He helped me set it up with some of the summer earnings I had made during that time. So I was familiar with these terms. And so I graduated with the understanding you need to have a budget, stay out of credit card debt, and start saving money because that's how your dad was able to afford to send you to college. And now you need to figure out how to save for your own retirement. Those concepts were drilled in my mind. And through, I guess, a couple of lucky things. One, in management consulting at the time, I was taught how to create a forecast model using Excel. So I was like, what better way to practice Excel skills? Because that was how nerdy I was. By creating your own budget and retirement forecast. So at age 21 or 22, I created my very first budget and retirement forecast. And based on that forecast, I was like, okay, if I want to retire by age 65, I just kind of figured this out. I knew that I had to spend below my means. So I
Mm.
lived comfortably, but relative to other people who I think made the same amount of money I did, I lived more frugally
Mhm.
than they appeared. So that already started happening. Second, because I was also working for a management consulting firm, and at that time we were very well known for doing a lot of mergers and acquisitions, the legal team told us do not buy individual stocks. It can get you into a lot of legal trouble. You have access to a lot of information that people do not. So at that time, I was also introduced to the idea of doing mutual funds instead of stocks, which, as we know today, is one of the more diversified, lower risk approach to investing. But it's a really great way. Then ultimately, I think I was just a constantly curious person in the beginning years in management consulting, you're not doing much sexy stuff at all. You're the research grunt. You're the one doing a lot of phone calls, taking a lot of notes, going through Google, going through databases, pulling out information. It gets boring. And I was like, why am I doing all this? I know why, but I was like, how is it that I could claim to be somebody strategic when I'm not running a business at all? So from that, plus the fact that I did have photography experience in yearbook in high school, and I played up that hobby in college. And Jeanette, you noticed because I took some of your wedding photos. That
Yeah, I did.
together kind of convinced me that perhaps I should start a wedding photography business. Again, no real plan, just choosing to follow this curiosity of how far can I push this? Because I'm just like I'm always gonna look for ways to push my skill set. And so from that, by the time that I had applied for business school, I was making good money as a management consultant. I was also making good side hustle money as a wedding photographer. It was the 08, 09 recession. So it was really scary applying to business school because everybody was applying because plenty of people lost their jobs during the recession. Extremely lucky that when I got my acceptance letter to University of Chicago booth, I was again gobsmacked to find that in the acceptance package, there was a separate letter that said, "We're granting you a half scholarship." I was like, "What? I didn't know that business schools gave out scholarships. And what merit do
They
I have?" I was
usually
like,
don't. Yeah, like, how did you get one?
I to this day, I don't know, but I have to guess that maybe I just looked so different than all the other applicants because Chicago Booth has a very famous part of their application, which is a PowerPoint application. It freaks most people out, and they actually displayed our PowerPoints during one of the the first weeks of school, so we saw what other people wrote in their applications, and I realized I think I realized how they saw me as different. Most people use like a page to describe their childhood, a page to describe their career, and maybe like a page to describe their personal life. I chose four song lyrics, and each page was built around a song lyric that like described a part of my life. And it was just a little bit more visual, like more of a more artistic approach. So I was like, okay, maybe, and I realized in business school too that I just it's a little bit different than others. So I was like, okay, it's my you're different scholarship. It's like we want you because you don't look like a normal business school student. And yeah, in business school, I just had a breakup with my first boyfriend at the time. I was not really in the mood to date long term. I was like, you got to get through business school and move on with your career. Keep going on that Shanghai School manifesto. Get to CEO one day. But yeah, it just so happened that naturally over time, my husband and I met our first year and built up a friendship and then started dating our second year and kind of knew within a couple of days that each other was the one. So,
Can we dive a little bit into that? Oh, by the way, I just want to clarify for all the listeners who don't know Shang. Shang was like a really good photographer. I think you became a
Yes.
wedding photographer at a time when now it's like really trendy and you have all these people who are like doing, it's like become a really big thing, right? But you kind of were on the earlier side of that before it really became like a big thing to do all these wedding photos. And I definitely remember you being like really good. So it wasn't
Yeah.
like, Shang's just like, oh, I'm just doing this on the side. Like it was a legit business. I don't know what your numbers were,
Yes.
but I can tell everybody that you were, like, on par with actually professional photographers who were full-time.
Yes. I can
Yes.
attest to that because I think Shang, you did her wedding for free because you were trying to build up your portfolio. And we
yeah.
actually had somebody that we hired too, right? Like, but the photos that we have on display, like 80% of them are yours. So
Oh my
because
goodness.
it actually turned out that the person we hired and paid actually was far inferior to your quality of work. So yes, I can totally attest to that. I can tell you, well, from what I heard, by kind of like the middle to the end of your photography career, I don't know if you're still doing it, but I mean, you were I don't know how to put this. Like I think you were, your fees reflected your talent. Let's just put it that way, and your
I
talent was
I
high.
I think my
So
minimum
And you were booking
package.
out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
at that time, this was I stopped the business about 10-ish years ago. At that time, my minimum fees were 5,000 for a wedding, so we can
right,
add
yeah,
inflation on top of that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I made good
Which is a
money.
teaser to a different section of her book called Side Hustle, So You Think You're Ready. Yeah, I added that subtext. Okay, cool. So you fall in love with your boyfriend, you're meeting his parents, things are getting serious. You're like, okay, you graduate and you both do you do you, do you move to he moves to New York and you're in California and then you're gonna move? Like there's
Oh,
something
yeah.
happening here?
My goodness, that was complicated. Because I had, again, my whole manifesto, I gotta carry through, get my MBA, get another fantastic job, which at that time was startups and tech, because now startups and tech are the new oil, so to speak. And so I had my heart set on doing a tech product management job in San Francisco, Bay Area. I had configured my classes such that in my final quarter at business school, I would have all my classes on Mondays so that I could fly out to San Francisco to interview because back then tech didn't recruit. MBAs. They didn't think that the MBAs had any skill to begin with. So I was like, I had to go out and hustle. And I landed a job offer in that spring, and they're like, you got to start right away. I was like, okay, I can do it as long as you're okay with me being back in Chicago for the weekend. And so Mondays, I had my classes. Monday night, I flew out to San Francisco, worked Tuesday to Friday. Then Friday, I think I did a red eye back to Chicago, did my homework on Saturday or Sunday, I forget. One of those days I did my homework. The other day I saw my husband or, dating him at the time, and then rinse and repeat until we graduated. And then I moved over to San Francisco full time. So yeah, I don't remember sleeping very much at that time,
Oh my god.
because
This is,
the
like,
first one to
next
get the offer.
level.
I really don't remember
Mm.
how my body got through it. Again, youthfulness. Oh, I miss those times because I'm turning 40 as well. It's like, oh, I can't do that anymore. My husband, on the other hand, his skill set was better fit for a New York City career. He got his offer much later than I did. So we were long distance during sort of the first year and a half after business school until he proposed. And I was like, look, I'm not moving without a ring because if we break up in New York City, the odds are stacked against me. I have to start all over again. I hate dating in a big city. So he proposed. And I decided to move to New York to be with him, gave up the tech
Mm.
job and started anew again.
And I
So
feel like
so you
oh,
Go for it.
oh, sorry.
Go for it,
Well,
Kate.
I don't know if I'm cutting too far ahead, Susan, you can tell me, but I feel like this part is also really interesting to me because I don't know I think I met your husband like once or twice,
Yeah.
Sean, because by that time I think I was like in China but in your book, you specifically call out your relationship with him as a turning point for how you saw money
Yeah.
differently. Sorry, Susan, I don't know if
Yeah.
that's jumping ahead or you were gonna. Yeah, okay, okay, thumbs up. Okay, yeah. So can you talk about that? Because I think I've gotten a lot of questions from friends who are planning to get married or they're like just getting engaged and they'll ask me and or Nara of like, "Oh, how do you guys do your finances?" Like how I think that's a
Mhm.
very it's an important but I think also kind of sensitive question because people will do things differently or sometimes it's hard when you combine two people who are very successful and maybe they have kind of different philosophies around money. I know that Nirav and I have had a lot of arguments because we see money a little bit differently.
Mm.
So, I was wondering if you could tell us the story of how you and your husband came together financially.
Yeah. And I mean, spoiler, no two people in a marriage are ever going to agree 100% on money, and that's okay. But you do want to make sure that the two of you are rowing your canoes towards the same spot, ideally, even though one of you might row more in circles, the other one does more straightforward. And that was actually something that my husband thankfully knew from a young age that there should be financial compatibility in a marriage on top of all of the other things. And what was interesting to me, the first time I met his parents, which I think was too early because it was like barely weeks into dating, but it was Thanksgiving and I had nowhere to go. So I went with him. The moment I met his parents, I still remember it was dark. We rode up to, this little house in Orange County, California. Mother-in-law opens the door. I see four cats running in the background. And I grew up in a household with no pets. I was like, oh, cats. Okay. I'm not ready for this. And then she like gave me a hug. I usually shake people's hands when I first meet them. Like in Asian culture, you don't hug people from the elder generation. You bow, you shake their hands, do something reverent. So she gave me a hug. I was like really put off by that in a good way, but scared. And then, like, they, like, addressed my husband by his first name, but in, like, a loving way, and they said, "I love yous," like, openly. I was like, "This is a different way to live, and it sounds really nice." Like, these are kind of the loving parents I wish I had growing up because my parents provided for me, and I absolutely, don't judge them for I know they did the best that they can, but in the department of emotional safety, they kind of failed on that end.
Mm.
And they weren't there for me for most of my important things. They rarely ever said that I did well. It wasn't until I got into Harvard when they finally admitted that they were proud. So I grew up not having that. And I remember talking to him, I'm like, "Well, how can I have more of that? Like, how do we do that for our kids?" We knew wanted to have kids, and he brought up the idea. He's like, "Look, if you want to have a better relationship with your children, better than the one that you have with your parents, you kind of need to be around. You need to be emotionally available. You need to be part of their lives. You need to show up to doctor's appointments and baseball games and things like that. And that might mean that your career would take a hit." And he was very influenced by the book written by Elizabeth Warren and her sister called The Two Income Trap. noting that even though most American households today have two incomes, they're actually not much better off than decades ago when most households were off of one income because everything in terms of cost has risen. And he's like, what if we could exit that? What if that would not be something scary? Like, what if the motherhood penalty is actually not a penalty to you at all? And the path to that, he argued, was for the two of us to learn to live off of one income for the rest of our lives. He's like, if we can make life off of one income, then should there be children? And he didn't, there was no expectation that I would be a stay at home mom or he would be a stay at home dad. It's just, it just gives us the flexibility to not fear losing income because we became parents and needed to be there for our children.
It's like, was he, like, kind of on this path even before you guys met? Like, that sounds
Hmm.
very fire-ish, right? Like, fire for those I mean, Shang talks a lot about this in her book, but fire is financial independence, retire early. It's like this kind of whole subculture of aggressive savings to for more freedom, right, in your life
Lots of
choices.
frugal people.
Um Yeah, lots of frugal people, and there's different flavors and, but, like, was he kind of already on the fire path or fire mindset even before you guys met? Or it's like he's like,
Yeah.
"Oh, well, now I found a life partner. I'm thinking ahead. There might be kids."
He was
Like,
on the frugal path even before I was, but he did it out of necessity.
Mm.
So, speaking of different upbringings, whereas I was completely blind to the fact that my parents were actually upper middle class the entire time, my husband's parents were working class, paycheck to paycheck. There was no safety net for them. And I can't share too much, but his parents went through a very traumatic financial situation while my husband was growing up. He saw how you could literally lose everything overnight. And
yeah.
so he was determined to not have that happen to him. He was a full scholarship student. Had a scholarship for college, scholarship for business school. And so he was determined that through his earnings that he would never let that happen to his
Mm,
family because of how traumatic it was. I mean, they were homeless at one point. And I totally understand where that comes from because your childhood and those kind of salient experiences really influence how you think about money as an adult. And so he was very frugal. He's also very analytic. So those he kind of removes more of the emotions from spending. So that made it he was just more effective at being frugal, optimizing things. He also worked in management consulting. So he loved, calculating everything on his spreadsheet. He also had his own model. Our two models were not compatible, by the way, could not merge the two models. And
That's your growth rate assumptions? Uh-huh,
I was
uh-huh.
like, you have way too many lines compared to mine. It was interesting because I think we had a lot of stuff in common already, and that both of us were laser focused on building wealth, but for very different reasons. For me, it was proving myself, and for him, it was a source of safety and provision to allow him to continue the legacy of love that his parents modeled for him.
So you moved to New York. You guys have your first jobs out of business school, and you agree to this thesis that is, like, so wise, like, "Yeah, I'll do that with you," and yet you're bitter. You're bitter about it, like, you're not having fun because then you're like, "Why can't I go to this networking thing?" Or like, "Oh my god, I spent my $1,000 discretionary annual allowance on this," like, "Oh my god, asking to be a bridesmaid." The worst, because it costs so much money, and you're out of the money. You're like, you're bitter. You're
Yeah,
bitter. How does this
angry.
get resolved? I mean,
Yeah,
like, I it's like because on a rational level, I would also agree to such things, but, like, I'm still an impulsive spender, I'm like, "Oh my god," like, tell us what is happening now."
yeah. So to compare and contrast how our budgets would fit once we got married, for my husband, very little change because he basically was already his discretionary spending was already at the level needed to meet the live off of one income thing. But for me, I had to reduce 75% of my nice to have spending. So like we knew that the rent was set. We found a very low cost apartment. We know that we all have to eat and you can't change some of that stuff. You have your MTA, your subway card, but the eating out, the clothing, the travel, the even just like nice things like having a nice gym membership or anything like that, all of that had to go. And I distinctly remember, Kate, I think you actually had a closet sale at that time.
Oh,
And since you and I are
yeah.
around the same size, I bought a Gal Azrael
You bought
dress
a dress.
from
I
you.
remember this was in yes, yes, I remember this.
It was
Uh-huh.
such a beautiful dress. That I think was one of my only designer items in my closet for those very first few years. And oh my gosh, I treasured that dress so much, Kate, because it looked so good on me too. I was like, oh my gosh, this is the best. And I got it for like, a huge discount. And as I was decreasing my spending, I didn't see anybody else in my life doing that. All of my other peers coming out of business school who made the same, if not more, than I did because I went to retail, which paid less than consulting and banking. They were spending more. They were going out. They were traveling. They were having their weddings at the Four Seasons in Hawaii. And to go, you have to stay at the Four Seasons. I was like, nope, can't afford that. My Harvard friends were also making it, getting onto Forbes 30 under 30 list and things like that. And by all external signs, I thought I was the failure by that point. I was like, shouldn't I have made it by now if all my friends look like they did? Then why does my life look not remotely anywhere close to that? And I intellectually I knew that maybe most people weren't doing what we were doing, but it doesn't make it feel any better when you feel so alone doing all of
Mm.
this. And so I committed because I'm the kind of person who commits to something because that's just, I guess, the obedient part of who I am. I said, I'll pursue this with one income, but I did it kicking and screaming for the first couple of years because I felt alone and I didn't know where to place all these emotions that I felt about money. And that really, really came to a head. And that's like what I kind of unravel in the book and how I finally figured out how to handle all those emotions.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll get to the book eventually, but I think I've read a few personal finance books over my life so far, and I feel like one thing that is really different about your book is the way it just says, outright, basically, yeah, like things about your childhood, like your things that you saw your parents do, like what you think about how you think about yourself relative to your peers, like all of that really are like the root sources of like your money habits. Right. And
Mhm.
so I think that that's very powerful and it's very true. Right. But I feel it's very under discussed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Shang.
I
Oh,
was like,
sorry.
why was I struggling so much with this concept of being frugal when I knew mathematically that it worked? I was like, the mathematical part of my brain's like, yes, this is working. You will get to where you are going. But then the emotional side of my brain's like, this sucks. And it couldn't figure out how to meld the two.
And when you started your coaching business, you'd be like, "All right, let's talk budgets. Like fill out these spreadsheets. Let's check in monthly. Let's and you started to find out that your clients didn't always do the homework or they
Yeah.
didn't always stick to the budget. And then you started meeting clients and having the time to talk to them about their background and their upbringing and their conditioning about why it was so hard to not spend here anymore. Can you talk to us about what are the 3 money problem root causes that you've started to see these patterns with your clients over time?
Yeah. And to establish the timeline, I moved to New York in 2013. The the years where I really struggled with the budget were 2013, 2014. By end of 2014, I fully committed. In 2016, we reached what I defined as work optionality. In 2017 is when I started coaching people because kind of the word started getting out. And to Susan's point, when I first began coaching, it was mostly not friends, but like friends of friends who heard about me, who had debts, and wanted a debt-free plan. So I was like, okay, I just mainly need to know how much extra money can we set aside each month for you to pay off your debts. And I'll help you do that in an optimal way by rearranging your debts or organizing the debts. And then each month I would check in and ask people, hey, how much were you able to pay towards the debt? What can we celebrate? Do you have any questions for me? And people were just, lagging in their responses or not getting their numbers back to me, not telling me what's going on at all. And the difference between the people who did and the people who did not I came to eventually realize was the root causes, and it had a lot to do with mental health. And over time, once I realized this is what's going on and I changed the way that I coached, I was able to break it into three main root causes: feast and famine, adverse events, scarce immigrant. For feast and famine, you typically grow up in a family that is low income, but not always. But the family lives paycheck to paycheck. So when there's money, feast, spend it all. Famine, when there's no money, go into debt. And the cycle just goes in, and you cycle in and out of credit card debt constantly. There's no extra money to speak of. So there's no financial planning that's being modeled. And so when you grow up as an adult, you're also very likely to be very impulsive in your spending. Now, you might make good money, but because you never saw your parents plan for having extra money, you just spend it all. So that's feast and famine. And by the way, you can relate to one, two, or all three of these root causes. They're not mutually
Of
exclusive.
oh, joy.
Second one, which I have a little bit of, is adverse events. Adverse events, in the most technical scientific term, I most closely align with this study sponsored by Kaiser CDC. It was done with 17,000 children, where they followed them from youth to adulthood to see what adverse events in the childhood could impact in terms of their mental and financial, not sorry, mental and physical health. So if you grew up with things like death of a parent, separated parents, violence in your community, violence at home, drug abuse, obese parents, etc., these events all could lead to higher incidences of obesity, depression, anxiety, and other severe physical and mental illnesses as an adult. And Susan, I remember just reading your book, The Manicure's Daughter, and just seeing that thread, like, wow, like you were really diving into that trauma as well. As an adult, if you grew up with adverse events in finances, I define it as making money and resources conditional. So your parents are supposed to love you unconditionally. But in adverse events, money or resources are only released to you conditional on you having done or identify with something that your parents cared about. In my parents' case, I think there was an adverse event in that they didn't quote unquote release my college fund until I had proved to them that I could be capable of being successful. Um, so as an adult, your money habit is often identity seeking. All of your life, you grew up trying to prove yourself, trying to be worthy of this impossible standard that you were held to. And so as an adult, you either you spend on things that make you feel like you're successful. So this could be luxury products, it could be makeup, beauty treatments, or you could be just so single-handedly focused on establishing your career, which is what happened to me. And so that identity seeking behavior means that you're always trying to pursue something, and it's hard to step off that hamster wheel. Third root cause, scarce immigrant, what I think a lot of us can relate to, is that our parents were immigrants and wanted to establish a better life for their children. And they took a huge risk in leaving their countries of origin to do so. And if they took that big risk of leaving everything they knew behind, their culture, their families, everything that they knew, they don't want to pass that risk onto their children. And so many immigrant children grew up hearing from their parents: do good in school, get a stable job, be a doctor, engineer, lawyer, don't take the risk that we did, do well. And so I've come across a lot of immigrants where they say, "Oh, I have scarcity mindset because my parents were frugal." I'm like, that's actually not exactly the kind of connection. It's that your parents had to be frugal because they didn't have a lot, but they imparted on you an avoidance of risk so that as an adult, you may also avoid risk. And I see this very common in immigrant children: avoidance of investing in the stock market because it sounds like something that's too scary for them, avoidance of taking risks in their own careers, meaning they might take a long time to leave toxic situations, or maybe they were born to be an entrepreneur, aka me, but felt that they had to stick to the straight and narrow, defined corporate path for longer than they should be. And that was, I think, these three root causes probably explain like 90% of the so-called bad money behaviors that I came across in my financial coaching.
Yeah, I would say I relate to all 3. I'm just like, are these all 3 compatible? But, like, yeah, I probably can relate to all 3 because I think, like, my parents also are a little unusual compared to a lot of other Asian Americans I met in college. I mean, Susan, I don't know if you felt this way, but a lot of, like, Asian Americans I met in college and in high school too, because I ended up being a scholarship student at a private, boarding school in New England. The Asian Americans that I met, like a lot of them were coming from like their parents, like were graduate students. That's why they came to the US, like that kind of background. And, my parents they didn't go to college. I was the first one in my family to go to college. And they very much like, I think it was a both a positive but negative thing in that, like, they very much just spent the money that they had, right? And they
Mhm,
didn't really plan for anything, especially my dad, he was very impulsive, and my mom didn't have a lot of she didn't have enough control. She had more control, but she didn't have enough control over the entire situation to, like, basically make sure there was enough of a buffer. So, like, on the
mhm,
positive side, I felt like there were these times when um, my parents, I think, showed me, like, ways we could celebrate, but, like, in a way that ultimately, like, as a teenager, I came to view as irresponsible. And so
mhm.
I probably have a lot of reactivity to them, as an adult, where, I remember as a teenager, like, it's weird because the things that I would fight with my parents about are like, "Hey, dad, like, should you really be going to this restaurant? Which credit card are you using?" Like that kind of conversation.
Wow.
And then my dad would get like pissed because he doesn't want to be asked those types of questions from his
Mhm.
14-year-old daughter,
Right.
and but from my perspective, I'm like, you clearly have no control over this situation. So that's why I feel like I have to ask. So, so yeah, I feel like as I was reading, I can there's elements of each that I unfortunately can relate to.
There's something else that it came to me as you and Jeanette were talking, Shang, which is that I think there's maybe a general assumption among people that if you like went to Harvard or Yale or MIT or some really good school, therefore you must also like be really smart about your finances.
Mhm.
I don't know if a
Right.
lot of people think, but I think for the longest, I actually remember when I went to college, I was a little shocked because, like your parents, my parents were always clipping coupons and living frugally. And they always, number one lesson, no credit card debt ever, right? So it's
Yeah.
interesting when I first went to Harvard, I met some people who were in credit card debt and not for like college tuition. No, because Harvard offered a lot of options. You didn't need to be in credit card, but like for shopping, right? And so that's when
During
first
school.
was like, yeah, during school. Uh-huh, like,
Oh
when they
my
were at
god.
Harvard. Yes, yes, I was very I won't name any names. I don't think actually you guys even know that, but anyway, it was more than once, right, that I heard this, and so, over
Mm.
time, I just realized and then actually, Shung, back to when you mentioned, like, your dad had opened, like, a Roth IRA for you, I remember the day you told me this from college because I was like, "What is
I
a
told you
Roth
that?
IRA?" I don't remember.
What?
Yes, yes, like, we were talking I can't remember the context exactly, but I remember very distinctly being like, how come Shang already has like a retirement account? Isn't she still in college? Because unlike your parents, my parents, they were all about the saving and actually recently wrote an article on this, but not about actively investing, right? At the time.
Mm.
And so I guess all
Mhm.
this to say is that I think there is a fallacy of belief that I held, and maybe a lot of people hold that, oh, just because you're really smart and you go to Harvard, you must also be really good about your money. And that's not at all the case. That's really not at all
I
the case, right?
I think that was also part of my struggle after business school. I was like, you're quantitative. You're trained to think in numbers. You know how to do financial modeling. Therefore, you should be able to execute this plan of living off of one income. But somehow all of that intelligence, all of that education went out the window. And I'm like, I feel like I'm struggling like everybody else mentally. How can it be?
I say that to give a little hope because I think maybe some people find financial literacy very daunting, like, "Oh, it's a luxury for the wealthy." And I think I mean, I don't follow you as close as my husband, who is a fan, Shang, but I think what he really appreciates about what you do is that it's very accessible. Because I think for me, I always thought, oh, because my family, I guess we're middle class growing up, right? I always thought, oh, it's like something when you're really wealthy, like you're WASP, you're like a,
Right.
WASPy
Right.
person. And then your parents like passing all this like secret investment advice to you and like, you know what to do. And I think as I've gotten older and had my own learnings about finance, it's really not a secret. Like there are some basic things. They're not really secretive or a secret, but I think there's a big mental block maybe in people thinking
Yeah.
that, "Oh, well, I don't have this income, so I don't think I can afford to think about doing something in this way." And you do talk about it in your book, right? Where some people have this block where, "Well, I'm not at this particular income, so I don't think I can afford to invest in this way." Can you talk a little bit more about that mindset and then also how people can, I think even for like undergrads, people who are current undergrads or if they're recent college graduates and maybe they work in the public sector like me and Susan and we were like not earning a lot of money. I think that's why I put off investing for a long time until I got my first quote unquote real job, aka a job that had like benefits and retirement
Mhm.
and like
Mhm.
was, six figures. But that was like not until my late 20s, right? And so I feel like this mindset is very prevalent. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it would be really great if you could kind of talk about that and how can we get over that mindset?
I was very lucky because I think for me, despite what my parents said growing up and everything, despite my misconception that I thought we were not well off, they did make the practice of personal finance a skill, like cleaning my
Mm,
room. And in college, my parents did give me a small amount of spending money, primarily for replacing clothes, any other materials that, the books budget they had didn't cover. And I had my very first budget. It was a Word document where on one side it was how what the item was, and the second column was how much I spent, and the third column was how much do I have left in my checking account. And my parents normalized the idea that there's no shame in being frugal and there's no shame in working hard with whatever you got. So that's what they passed to me. And then as I studied my coaching clients and the mindsets that they had around money, I realized that you have to be in a good spot mentally to even want to change your personal finances. That's the ideal case. Or the second case, which is more commonly how people get referred to me, is you're in crisis and you realize you have to change your money. Like I do work with a lot of people going through separation and divorce, and that's actually where I get a lot of my referrals from as well. But like Jeanette said, her parents growing up, they didn't even have the mental bandwidth to sit down and like let's organize our bills, let's figure out can we afford all of this. Like they were just working so much, right? And this is actually covered by a book called Scarcity. It's called the bandwidth poverty, in that your mind is just so focused on making your basics, paying rent, having food, having gas in your car, that you can't think about anything else. And
Yeah,
it's
it's
the
like
in that
Abraham the Maslow pyramid, right, of, like,
yeah.
needs, like, which is at the
Yes.
bottom. You need to,
yeah.
like, be fed before you can think about anything else.
Yeah, but I don't know. It's just hard because I think my parents were literally like, "Oh, rent is due like in 5 days. Do I have enough money to cover rent?" You know what I mean? It's hard for me to imagine operating in that fashion right now. But like I think that's how my parents ran their finances. I think my mom was more organized, but my dad was very impulsive and
Mhm.
he was the primary breadwinner for some time. And so my mom just didn't have control of over the entire situation, you know what I mean? And
Mhm.
so and I think a lot of people still like that's the way that they run their life, right? And it's like you need to find some way to get out of that hole, right? Of just looking 5 days ahead to see if you can cover basic necessities. That's a very hard place to be in.
A mental break. And I find that
Yeah.
even now, like when I was finishing up my book and both my kids had not like life-threatening health issues, but they both had ramped up the number of doctor's visits that I had to take them to. And then something else happened, and I realized I was like running on fumes basically for the last few months, and I just couldn't get stuff done. So I absolutely also understand that how parents in particular, we get to a point in our lives where you're just running on fumes and you don't even know what else to prioritize at that point. You're under a
Yeah.
lot of pressure, and these pressure moments actually make or break your financial situation. When our brains are under pressure, and it can be just stress in general, but it could also be actual diagnosed anxiety, depression, mood disorders, etc., our brains actually lose the ability to function at the executive level. So Jeanette, you're thinking, okay, how do I think ahead? How can I plan? That's executive level functioning. It happens in the prefrontal cortex of our brain, the part of our brain that actually controls our emotional responses. But when our brains are under pressure, when we go into one of these crisis like situations, we lose control. We actually don't even get enough oxygen to the prefrontal cortex. And our brain reverts back to either or both the limbic system, which is the emotional part of our brain, or the brain stem, the reptile brain, which is just survival mode. And we go off of what we know instinctively as children. And so that's when a lot of people cycle back to the same things that their parents showed them how to do. I'm not saying teach, it's just what their parents had shown them. And that's where you get these cyclical behaviors. And it's made worse under duress, under layoffs, when, there's an addiction going on, etc. And that's why in the book I talk about how if you don't address the underlying root cause, like what's causing all of these feelings, what's causing this survival mode, we try to dig ourselves. We gotta do that because your money issues, it's just a symptom. It's not the actual cause. There's something deeper that we have to fix. And then if we fix that, and you have the first step is deciding that you want to fix it. Because that's the number one thing I look for in my clients is like, do you actually want to get coaching? Do you actually want to change your lives? If not, I don't think you don't waste your money on me. You have to decide that you actually want change. And then I can teach you the way to change it. And then when we dig into that, and change happens over a long time, but once done in a healthy way, it does result in better money behaviors going forward.
This is really striking a chord with me with weight loss because between me and my husband, I mean, the man can just eat all the pasta he wants and drink all the beer he wants and just lean. He's always like, Susan, what's the big deal? It's just calories in, calories out, just like work out more than you eat, or whatever. And I'm sitting there going like, I understand rationally what you're saying. Like with finances, just spend less than you make. That's all you gotta do, And it's like, rationally, that makes sense, like, on an equation, it makes sense. But to
Right.
actually get there in your daily life and to make all the correct decisions so that you are in a place where you can actually invest money and be debt free and all these things, like, so much more has to happen, which is just deal with all your childhood trauma. Like, because otherwise it'll always resurface again,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Like, it's always gonna come back. Like, you lose the weight, you gain the weight, right? Because it's just really actually about this is how I deal with my emotions, right? So, anyways, I'm just sitting here being like, preach, sister. So, there's just so much riches here. And I know a lot of our listeners are just going to be wondering, like, Shung, I want to be work optional. How do I get to work optional? I'm just wondering, like, on a practical level, like, say you don't have credit card debt and you got 10,000 to spend or to invest. See, look at me and
Mhm.
my word choice. Freudian slip. What would you advise folks to do? Like, is it Vanguard, EFTs? Like, what would you do with the 10,000?
Yeah, great question. And I do have a chapter on investing and a chapter on work optional following that to kind of tie all of this together. Before we get to investing, I want you to establish a emergency fund. So I don't know if Susan, you had assumed whether this person had an emergency fund or not, but because so many people get into credit card debt due to layoffs or sudden loss of income, that basic emergency fund that you put into a high yield savings account, so it's online and kind of like hard for you to spend, acts as the buffer between before you go into a next cycle of credit card debt. And for most families, assuming that I am speaking to parents, I'd like for that to be about 6 months of must have expenses. It feels a lot, but it is a lifesaver. Once you have that, then the next part is start thinking through your work benefits first. Most people who work at a corporate job would probably have some form of a employer sponsored account like a 401k, also known as a 403b, 457b, TSB. But you can start with that, put as much money into that as possible. If you so happen to save so much that you reach the maximum on a 401k, which in 2025 is $23,500 for those ages less than age 50, Then you could also open your own retirement account, the IRA, which is apparently what I told Kate about when I was in college. That IRA could come in traditional or Roth tax flavors, which again, better explained in the book. And then if you somehow manage to max that out, which is $7,000 in 2025, the rest can go into a taxable brokerage, which is just any trading account that you open with any financial institution. A lot of people say, "Oh, you mean my Robinhood?" I'm like, "Yeah, like a Robinhood account is a taxable brokerage." As to what to invest in, I'm not your registered investing advisor, so I can't give you specific recommendation, but I can tell you what generally most personal finance writers would say is keep it diversified, spread out your risk. Like if you think about it, if you put all your money in one company, you can easily fail. I mean, most companies I think 80% of them fail in like 5 to 10 years. But if you spread it out, chances are you'll find a golden goose in one of them. So what most people in the US do, because they're not professional stock traders, is buy the entire market, which is called an index fund. So you don't have to even think about it. You just buy something that allows you to invest in hundreds, if not thousands, of companies with the hopes that the corporate hamsters will work hard enough for your money to grow. Another way that a lot of my clients also build their wealth is through real estate investing. And this is primarily not from the home that you live in, but by becoming a landlord. So you own different apartment units or condos, whatever, you rent them out for rental income. And over time, if your net worth continues building and you're, saving money, you're living on less than you spend, when your net worth reaches 25 times your annual expenses, that is the classic definition of FIRE, financial independence, retire early. So just to give very easy numbers, if my net worth was $1 million and I lived on a budget of $40,000 or less a year, which is possible in, Midwestern, lower cost rural places in the country, then I would be considered FIRE at that moment. And that number is going to be different for everybody because you have different needs, different household sizes, different lifestyle preferences. But in general, the pathway for most people to fire is keep building up your income, keep lowering your expenses, invest the difference, get to 25 times my annual expenses.
Susan, you
I would
look.
just like oh, no, I started calculating. I was like, "Oh, okay." Um, well, I just wanna add with the low index funds, what we do is S&P 500. That's one of the things we do, and with
That's an index
Vanguard, we
fund.
open an account there, and we
Yeah,
and we do VOO. But
also an
the
index fund.
reason why we do S&P 500 is that at business school, I loved my professor. He had this British accent, and he was like, "Can you assume that if you pick stocks and you think you're so right that over a 20-year horizon that you will beat the market?" No, because the S&P 500 has, and then he'll show it. And he'll give every single scenario, even like dedicated money managers who this is their job, and S&P 500 always beats them over a long-term
Yeah,
horizon of 20 years. And
yeah.
that was like the answer every day in class for like 10 sessions. And it
Brilliant.
was becoming so hilarious because when you leave class, you become irrational. And you're like, I think I can beat the market. You know what's good right now? You know who just IPO'd? Like you
Mhm.
think you can, but
Yeah.
but really you just want to average out like basically S&P
Yeah.
500 is a lot of the tech companies make up the top ones,
Yeah.
right? So like that's diversifying and then all the other ones. So anyways, that's what I think it's like I've always read that advice and then I was always like, but which one? Also, I am not a registered stock trader and I cannot also give financial advice. So I'm not giving you advice.
Don't sue us,
But
guys.
S&P 500. Well, you know what I mean? Like it's just like it gets really overwhelming
Yeah.
once you're like, okay, I'm doing all these things, but then there's just still too many choices, right? And then you just like kind of turn off and be like, I'll think about this later. And then years
Analysis
pass and you didn't
paralysis.
invest anything.
Yeah.
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 I also think
Okay.
Susan brings up a good point, which is that in this digital age where there are a lot of influencers of all ilks, including financial influencers, so I don't follow any of them, but Nirav does
Mhm.
for his work. And sometimes they get advertised to me, right? And I actually would
Mm.
like to know what Shang would think about this, or maybe it's more like her advice on how to deal with this, because what I see often are basically these very glamorous um, posts or articles about here's how you can travel like this luxury way and blah, 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 here are all these shortcuts. And I feel like on the surface, yeah, that sounds really cool, but actually I feel like it can add potential stress because and also I'm not really sure how sound some of these
Mhm.
this advice is, and also I find that it's often without the context of real life, right? Because a
Yeah.
financial like a so-called financial influencer, they're living in a maybe a very different life from you, except the advice that they're providing is not contextualized. I find that very frustrating. I kinda wanted to get Shang's thoughts on that and how maybe I feel like maybe you're a little different. And again, I don't follow you as closely as my husband
Yeah.
does.
No
But,
worries.
like, how do you give advice on, what's good advice, what's not good advice that we get, exposed to, and how do you determine what makes sense for you?
And it's not just financial content. I think all content
Right.
has now become
Yes.
coachified. Like there's a whole cottage industry of coaches for every scenario you can think of, and we have social media to thank for that, and also remote work, like people realizing that they can be their own bosses. At the end of the day, I think it's just most important to ask yourself, like, what is this person motivated by when they're selling me this kind of stuff? Like, what is it that they actually want to achieve? And there are many bad actors in any industry where they just want to sell you something and be done with it. For example, travel influencers, they get paid I think the equivalent of $100 for every credit card sign up that they can drive you towards to, get some credit card points to learn how to travel on points and miles. And so at the end of the day, I think we just have to remember nobody has all the answers and nobody can claim to know that they know the secret to investing because there isn't, as Susan mentioned, and the data has proved so. If somebody claimed that they knew the best way to invest, they better be the richest person in the world. Because that you're telling me that you can forecast the future. Because that's really what investing is, knowing where things are going to go. And then finally, I would also say for vetting whoever you choose to get the information from is look at experience. Like in general, if you're talking personal finance, if I'm seeing a 22-year-old giving out personal finance advice, which I wasn't doing at the time when I was 22, I'd highly question their life experiences because things can change overnight once you get married, once you have a child, once you lose your income, once you have elderly parents to take care of, or all of the above, as I think what many of us are dealing with right now, being the sandwich generation. And I would say I am probably in the quote unquote hardest like personal segment of my life at this moment, juggling all of those things. And so experience speaks volumes when it comes to personal finance as well.
Okay, so I'm so curious about your life now, Shung. Like, you have 2 kids that are under 6 years old.
Yeah.
You are work optional. Do you have a corporate full-time job? Like, are you doing Save My Sense full-time? Like, do
Yeah.
the ki are the like, are you still living frugally?
Hmm.
Like,
So
what's your life like
the
now?
update, yeah, and I give that update a little bit at the end of my book as well. I quit my fancy paying corporate job at CVS when my book deal was signed. I was like, I do need to give dedicated time to writing this book. As you know, you can't just, write it in the 1 to 2 hours you have left after working a 9 to 5. And I have 2 kids on top of that. And I'm also the default parent. And so I quit that knowing I was like, I'm gonna give this like 2 years. If after 2 years this is really not working out, I'll figure out something new. Thankfully, because I feel abundant, and I'm like, I'll figure it out. I've a good education. We live off of my husband's income. He continues to work at his corporate job, and I have asked him several times. I'm like, hey, I mean, money's not really an issue at this point. Do you want to do something else? And I guess he hasn't found that yet. You kind of do need to have a North Star for like, why do you want to leave your job? His original thesis was let's not fear unemployment as parents. Whereas when I finally bought into the idea of fire, I was like, I want to leave the crazy world of management consulting. So we have two different approaches. I also tried a whole year of not working with my first child. Now, it was an interesting year because that was COVID year, 2020, and I didn't work and I had postpartum depression on top. And I realized, you know what, that just wasn't for me. And so right now, I just get to do something that I love that brings a smile to my face, which is running Save My Sense full time. I do make money from coaching courses, and maybe I'll make a buck or two from selling the book. I don't know. Who knows what's going to happen with that? And we keep our lives, we get to enjoy a lot more things only because collectively, my husband and my income together, we can afford a lot. So I would say, relative to the average American, we probably spend more. But I would say we are very careful about our extravagance. To our kids see a, what I would say, a middle class type of lifestyle. No fancy house, no fancy cars, used toys and clothing, even though they don't really know the difference between those. Not a ton of, fancy ingredients in food. And if my husband and I do choose to be fancy, we still use credit card points to defray the cost of doing that. And we tend to go fancy for the two of us because we're like, we don't want our children to grow up assuming that you could be entitled to luxury off the bat. We kind of want them to learn over time that this still comes through work. We want them to cherish having a work ethic to the extent that they're capable. Obviously, if our children had, learning disabilities or other things, then we would be very kind towards that. And yeah, the goal is to be as charitable as we can be throughout our lifetime and instill this continuous legacy of love, as I like to say, from my in-laws, building a household built on the foundation of mutual love and love for the world.
When are you gonna teach them about compound interest?
As soon as their mathematical skills are ready. So BB, my elder, who's 5, he's getting an allowance soon. I need to make the little jars that I bought look a little prettier. But yeah, he's gonna learn the concept of give, save, spend in that order. So the 3 jars we have are for giving, for saving, for spending. So to help him see the priorities that we like to align to. So that will get started. We do talk very openly about the fact that mom and dad work and that things cost money. Like BB really loves Korean short ribs. And I'm like, that's expensive, yo. Like I can't afford to have it every day. So I do emphasize to him some things cost more than others and they're special. And so we can't have them all the time. But yeah, we make it fun, hopefully. And I think the important thing is normalizing it. Just normalizing money as an
Mm.
everyday topic instead of shying away from it.
Yeah. I do find that it's harder for me to be frugal with my children actually than for myself. Like, I think maybe it's just because of the way that I grew up. Like, I grew up in a very financially unstable home. So I'm kind of like used to it. And I think I'm like, I think also because of I saw like the way that my parents struggled and I think I came to see some of their decision making and the way they operated as like not very responsible. I think I was just more okay like with myself like making choices for a simpler lifestyle to avoid that. But then like with my kids, I do find that it's harder for me to deny them like certain things, or say no. Like yeah, so I
Yeah.
think maybe because I don't know, I mean, we could go to armchair psychology here on like why I feel that way, right? But like, I don't think we're like overly extravagant towards them, but we are like they have a lot of nice things. Like if they need clothes, we just go out and buy it for them. Like all we take them to Disneyland and they're like, "Why can't we go to Disneyland like next month?" I'm like, "No." Like that's the kind of conversation we're having and but I think that I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or if anybody can kind of relate to like the way you treat yourself financially versus like your kids, right? It's like for
Yeah.
me, I feel like there is a significant kind of mindset difference
It's your root
because I
cause
just
at
don't want
work,
to
Jeanette.
inflict. Yeah, maybe it's just like I just don't want to inflict the pain on them, right? And I think like maybe I do find I'm not sure. I'm like, do I find some of these self-imposed frugality or like, things just like certain lifestyle choices like painful, but then I also, I agree with you, Shang, in that like there are definitely like money related values that I want to impart to them, right? But it's different because they're growing up in such a different environment than I did.
Exactly.
Um and I think like also just my last sense on here, 2 cents here is it's also interesting because I feel like once you become a parent, you really like this is also one of the ways in which you need to start walking the talk, right? Like if you want
Mhm.
to impart like frugal values on your
Mhm.
kids, like you yourself actually have to adopt that lifestyle because your kids are going to not only see it, but they're part of your life, right? And so if you yourself are like, making all these choices, it's hard to then turn to the kids and say like, "No, you cannot do that," or "You cannot," So it's like I feel like that is also a challenge, right? It's like, and I feel like I kind of started noticing that too in when I was back in the corporate world, like just talking to like slightly older people with children, and like some of the struggles that they had were having around that.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, clearly you love your children, Jeanette, and I always encourage any parents, don't try to do things out of guilt or out of like beating yourself up for thinking that maybe you're not good enough as a parent. I think having that love is already fantastic. And every parent, you're going to know your child the best. So as long as you feel like you are showing the values that you want to pass to them, the things that you want them to learn, and it is within the realm of affordability for you guys, again, I'm not going to judge any of that. But I think as long as you and your husband are aligned on, okay, at kind of each stage of life, what is it that we want our children to learn and what do we think they're capable of learning? Like, I'm not going to teach my 5-year-old compound interest, but he can learn the difference between keeping some of his money and spending some of his money. And then also allow for the fact that there is still the randomness of genetics, and our children are not necessarily going to inherit all of our characteristics, and they have their own minds and they're going to want to do their own things. I actually sometimes study billionaires and their inheritors. And it is really, really interesting to see how some of the billionaires' children want to go a completely different direction with the foundations that their parents set up. So I'm like, you know what? At the end of the day, the best laid plans as a parent might still not work out. So just do your best, but don't beat yourself up because we still don't know what's going to happen regardless.
Yeah.
Nat, I can totally relate to you about like spending patterns. Like you can justify it for kids, but not yourself. Like, guys, I have finally joined the Stanley Cup revolution. I mean, this is imitation. This is not, it's like simple modernity or something. Like it's not Stanley Cup brand. But I yesterday I bought this like Stanley Cup like water bottle at retail price. It was not on sale.
That's a
Because do
big
you
deal for
know
Susan.
how long I've thought, God, I want to be a Stanley basic bitch. Like, I need to hydrate more, and I'm always in the car picking up my kid. And this is when I'm gonna hydrate. And I have all these other water bottles that when I, I drink from them, it like it just splatters out all over my shirt, or like water bottles that don't fit in the car container. And I've thought about this, I think maybe for a year and a half. Until I told Marvin, I was like, "I bought it for $34.99, it wasn't on sale." I was like, "But the Stanley Cup was $10 more." And he was like, "Okay." And he has no emotional attachment to this story, and I've thought about it for a year and a half because mama needs to hydrate more. Like, this is very important to my life, right? And I'm just sitting there going like, what if my kid, if the tread is running out on his shoes, right? Or like it's Seattle here. I'm gonna get the waterproof sneakers. I'm gonna get him the Japanese ones. You know what I mean? Like, because I know he needs it. And like I need to drink water, but I've thought and agonized about it for a year and a half. You know what I mean? Like I'm sitting here just thinking about how much I'm just like undoing, and it's like I just
Yeah.
hate these other water bottles where you have to unscrew the top and you're like you're stopping and you're going and then splash. Like I'm splashed on all the. Do you guys get splashed on all? Like it's anyways. I'm just trying to say like I'm like getting this. eh, I think I understand the assignment, but I need a change in my mindset.
No, I was gonna say my dad also big piece of wisdom. If it's a problem that money can solve, it's not a big problem. So also congrats on your new Stanley Cup. You solved it.
Well, yeah, it's I mean, it's a different brand, but it's more like I think actually through this podcast and talking with Jeanette about how we spend our time, like what are we spending our time on? What are we spending our money on? What are we allowed to delegate? Like, will it actually help your life? Why aren't you helping yourself? Like that has taken time to just kind of,
Mhm.
I gotta get honest about like what I'm doing, and like why am I always the lowest on the totem pole to help? You know
Mhm.
what I mean? Even though the
Mhm.
solution's very obvious. The solution is a $35 thing or Kate has some knockoff ones from China, you know? And it's
No,
like,
I think they're real. They're real. They're totally real, but my cousin bought them from the Stanley factory for a discount. Anyway, just making the
Kate, even if
clarification.
they were fake, I would love you,
Okay,
okay?
thank you.
Yeah, it doesn't matter
I mean,
if you were frugal
it
with
fits
them.
in your car cup holder. That was the brilliance of the Stanley Cup is it fits in the car cup holder, but holds a lot of water.
Yeah, it maximizes, it's a straw, there's no splashing on your face, which I hope I can leave everyone with that imagery that I've splashed myself a lot in the car. Okay, amazing.
I was only gonna kind of say that I like this holistic approach of it's not just we may do one thing differently from Jeanette, from Susan, from me. It's not specifically about that thing you do. It's also about the mindset that you do it with. Because you could imagine a world in which our like an immigrant parent would be teaching their kid about money, being like, "I work so hard for you," and guilt trip that kid right into feeling like they owe everything to their parents. And I think that's that's not healthy, right? But there are healthy ways to talk about it. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes maybe we fixate too much specific on this is like the exact right way or that's the exact right way. But yeah, I like how Shang, you were saying it's not specifically about like I'm going to judge you for doing this one specific thing. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we go into our insight thought, I'm gonna just like drop the bomb like I usually do,
Oh, so
with like
Korean.
10 minutes left. So I have been wondering and turning this over in my mind, like why talking about money like very explicitly is like so taboo. Um, just like how much money people make, right? Um, like how much money people have, like what is like their financial goal, like how much money they spend on certain things. I think I've been turning it over in my mind, and I think this question first came to me when I started dating Jake, my husband, because like for me, I'm kind of weird in a lot of ways, but I think one of the ways I'm also weird is like I knew like how much my parents made like every month. Because my parents like I said, I think objectively we're not very responsible financially. And I was concerned, like I would actually like dig through my parents' like paperwork and paychecks and stuff and like check checkbook and just like figure out like do we like what is our finances looking like this month? And I think that started like maybe in late elementary school. So I
Wow.
knew a lot about my parents' finances growing up, and I was shocked to understand, like, when I started dating Jake that he has no idea, like, what his parents make or, like, he doesn't know, and it's not really part of, like, his community and family of origin culture to, like, really explicitly discuss these things or ask about them. And so, this is just a question that I've been turning over in my mind because I feel like in Asian culture, it is like there are certain aspects of it that are more okay to talk about openly, just like asking people, like, well, how much money what is like your salary of this new job you got? Or like, or like, how much does this cost? Like that thing that you bought, or whatever. But I do feel like there's still some things that people don't like to talk about like openly, right? And so, not without going into like our specific situations because we don't have to unearth the taboo. That's not what I'm asking us to do, but I'm just like, why is it that it feels like such a hard thing to discuss like out in the open? And I have like some theories, but I want to like hear what you guys think. I don't know. Like Shang, is this something that you've kind of I mean, because you when you talk to clients, they probably share a lot of sensitive financial information with you, right?
Yeah,
And is that like really hard for them or why do you
it
think
is.
it's yeah.
I argue the opposite in my book where I'm like, for about like 7 or 8 chapters, I don't even talk about the budget because I was like, we've been conditioned, probably through media, probably through the culture, probably through everybody, that somehow your salary or your net worth or like how you spend is kind of part of your identity. Because if
Hmm.
you think about like how the media talks about successful people, it's always like, oh, Warren Buffett with a net worth of blah 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 blah, Elon Musk with a net worth, and it's just like, but like when we think about how we personally relate to our favorite people, I don't think of like, oh, Jeanette who works at blah blah blah. I'm like, oh, Jeanette, like the kind-hearted, wonderful sister in that I met in college. And I guess, like, when
Oh,
people
that's
first
sweet
talk
of
about
you because that's sweet of you because I feel like more in that stage of life now, but if I'm totally honest, it's not like I viewed people like just from the lens of like because they have this, they're like, useful to me in this way. I don't think that's how I thought about it, but I think what they did was very salient in my mind. And it's
Mhm.
really like only in the last couple of years after having kids and making the choice to like step off the corporate track that I actually feel, and this is really sad, like, I mean, maybe for me to say this, but I actually wonder if this is like reality for not just me, but for a lot of people, where like I'm very happy to see that like my friends are still around, and that they're still my friends, like even though I'm not not at a name brand job anymore, I'm doing things that are like kind of like, not in that doctor, lawyer, blah, 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 kind of track. And so
Mhm.
sorry to interrupt you, Shang, but it's like very nice for you to say that, and I believe you. But I'm saying like my own confession about it is like I really wasn't. I've kind of shifted more towards that mindset. It's like, but it's a transition. Like it hasn't. Maybe that part of it wasn't as salient. The other parts were more salient, like earlier on in my life. So sorry, that's a long aside.
I think most people are just afraid of judgment, like being judged like that just by a number. And maybe people feel a lot of shame over, or even if they even know their numbers too. Like there's a lot of those emotions around. And the more we don't talk about it, more shameful it becomes as a subject. Thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like there's judgment like in both directions. Like if you have a lot, like that actually invites judgment. And if you have a
Hmm.
little, that also invites judgment. If you're aiming for a lot, that invites judgment. If you're aiming for little, that invites judgment. It's like judgment in so many ways. Or it's like if you like make this much, but then you spend X, like if it's too high, there's judgment. If it's too low, there's judgment. You know what I mean? There's like so many layers and possible angles for judgment around money. So it's like I understand that, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, but yet in so many ways, we actually spend a lot of our time and energy and money signaling in different ways about our financial status, right? I mean, so I think like I find this whole thing like so fascinating because it's like we don't want to have like a direct conversation about it. That's very uncomfortable for us. But like we actually are communicating or send out signals about that all the time, right? So it's like I find it so fascinating, like why like this whole like dance it's so interesting.
I guess it's like social ranking. You're like, I don't want to be last. Like, how do I stack up against that? Like, speaking of naming the shame, Shung, when people tell me they've moved, I go look it up on Zillow how much they bought it for. I'm just like, "Oh, damn, okay." Like, it's this thing that I
Me
do, and
too.
I'm like,
Me
I'm sure
too.
I'm sure other people do too, and then
Yeah,
no matter what number it is, I haven't thought about it.
yeah, exactly.
It's none of my business, but then I'm like, "Oh, shoot, high roller now, okay." Okay. Like, hit you up for a charity donation. You know what I mean? Like, you do your own mental thought around it where it's just like, we're just freaking animals, you know? And like, we're just trying to like think about survival and tribalism and all this stuff when I'm like, congratulations, I've moved.
Yeah, I think especially with like the advent of social media and internet, it's like it's become, like so much more of that information that was easier to keep like more private maybe or discreet
Yeah.
is so much more accessible now, right? And so that's a kind of different conversation. All right, we don't have to dwell on this too much. Susan, do you want to take it away for us with a insight thought?
Yeah. All right, girl, you got $10,000. You got three little jars. Save, give away, and spend.
Mm,
You already got your 6 months savings. You've already maxed out all your Roth and whatever, what OKs. What are you gonna do with your 10,000? Like, so tell me the three
mm.
buckets. Like, how would you split up your 10?
It's
Is
like
what
a
I'm asking you
surprise
right now.
10,000, like 10,000 you didn't
Yeah, yeah,
expect.
yeah. Tax free.
Nice.
So, like, I'm giving it to you right now. What are you gonna you got the 3 buckets and you're not 5 anymore, so what are you gonna put it in?
Okay, my first instinct is to say 1,000 in the give, 4,000 on my spend, and then 5,000 in save. That's what I think I would do.
Who would you give it to?
I don't know. Who would I give it to? I mean, there's a couple of like nonprofits that I really like the work that they're doing. We Right now, our primary charitable giving is to our church, but then we also give to like other organizations. One of the organizations that I do like is one called Thread, and they have like a community-based approach, like a interpersonal approach to supporting like at-risk youth. And so I really like what they're doing. So someone like that I feel like kind of has like a different and innovative approach to solving a problem I care about that seems effective. Yeah, so something like that.
All right, cool. Kate, Chung?
Judgment.
Uh, well, I
No,
think my
I know I
division
would
would probably. Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. You go first, Shang.
okay. In general, because I think about how I reacted last time I got a bonus, which is a really, really long time ago. I usually don't spend more than 10% of an unexpected bonus. So I know the most that I would ever spend of that will be 1,000. Now, as to whether that 9,000 is all savings or all gifting, I know at the end of my life, most of my money gets gifted away. So that $9,000 probably I'll probably have, at least 1 to 2,000 to go to a nonprofit of my choice right away. But then the middle, my math is slow,
7.
8 to 9,000 or 7 to 8,000 would be invested until I have a better thesis around how I want to ultimately do philanthropy.
On brand. And where did you get this 10% thing that I'd only spend the 10%? Where'd you get that
I
number
don't
from?
know. Just I have these weird rules in my head, and I honestly can't tell you where it came from.
It's rational yet irrational. I love it. Okay, Kate, how about you?
Um. Yeah. Oof. Okay. I think I have like a complicated relationship about when to give, because part of me is kind of like Shang, where if I put some aside, like in a donor advised fund or some other vehicle, and then I can, you know, get interest and then donate more later on. But then I know there are some things that are pressing right now. So I would also probably split my giving into two buckets, which is one that I give now. And I do have a favorite org that I give to, which is our college classmate and friend, Glenda Aldana. She works for the Northwest Immigration Rights Project. We've been donating yearly since basically we moved here, and she does some really great advocacy work. So I would say that would probably be my number one give now, because I think that's the kind of work where it wouldn't wait. Right. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to be like, oh, I'll give in 5 years when like my money has, increased by this much. So that's the give that I would give now. I don't know about the exact amount. Gosh, it's kind of hard. Maybe like 1,000. And then I maybe earmark like another couple thousand for putting into some sort of vehicle where, if it gathers interest over time, I might give to another cause that's maybe a little less like time sensitive. I don't full disclosure, I do not donate to Harvard because I feel like my parents already do, and I feel like Harvard gets a lot of money. Like, I actually would rather donate to, a more local cause where I live. Not that I don't love Harvard, it's just that I feel like my parents are giving them, so I'm not anyway. But maybe that'll change when my kids get older. Just kidding, or not. I don't know. But and then I would spend some. I don't know. I kind of like, because I think, the two of you guys know Susan, and she said over the summer, Nirav and I went on a budget, aka he really put me on a budget. And then I was kind of annoyed at that by first, but now that I haven't been spending much money on myself, I'm like, oh, actually, I don't really need anything. I do agree with that in terms of Shang, where like my mindset was very resentful at first, but I did realize, I mean, I knew this all along, that I do think I do turn to retail therapy for some form of therapy, even though I get my own therapy, but it's actually kind of nice. I think maybe that's also my personality, where I need somebody to just be like, cut it off. And I'll be really pissed off at first, but then over time, I actually don't really have nothing to spend on. I'm like, "Oh, I don't really need this." Like, so maybe I'd spend 1,000 on like, I don't know, just random like recurring things like, oh, I really want this skincare product, or I need to like renew my skincare routine. I don't want to downgrade, to another product, that kind of thing, if that makes sense. And then like maybe I would save at least half of it and put it into some sort of index fund, because that's really easy. We already over indexed on real estate. So there's nothing really I can do with $5,000 on real estate anyway. So yeah, that's probably my sort of general approach to $10,000. Nerev's going to listen to this and he's going to be like, yeah, it worked. Anyway, sorry. I just wanted to comment that I do identify with Shang on that particular aspect that she called out in her book.
I'm just learning so much about each of you by your responses. I'm like,
With judgment or not, Susan?
whoa,
With
no,
love.
no. I think it really just reflects some like core values just by a simple question, right? And actually, for me, this is awful. I was like, which one am I? Am I adverse event money root problem caused? Because I was like, at first I was like, why don't I just spend the 5 on me, my inner child, because I have so much trouble spending money and like feeling I deserve things. And then I
Mhm.
flipped while you were all talking. I'm like, no, dude, Susan, you just got to invest it. Come on, like 10 years from now. And I'm like, yeah, and so I'm like having inner turmoil here. Because then I was like, well, what if I did 9 to invest? Because then that would be a lot more for the charity later. And then one day I could endow something. I'm like, no, you can't. That you want to endow something at Harvard? Maybe it'll be like a fork, you know what I mean, in a dining hall. Like I was like, oh yeah. And so I haven't split the numbers yet. Oh,
Okay.
About it. You don't
Maybe
have
you
to
don't have
come
to
up
So
with
split the
an
specific
answer.
numbers if it's too painful. Yeah.
also, I would note that this was your inside thought question.
Ow, zing, zing, zing.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna give away 3 to Theodore F. Jackson, and then I was like, I'm gonna. Oh God, this is terrible. Because then I was okay. Can I have 3 for myself and then invest 4?
Why are
You
you
can do anything
guilty?
you
Of
want.
course.
Well, because
You don't
really,
you
I
don't
want
need
to
our
just.
permission, Susan.
I just,
I
I
feel like
just
this is
want
such a perfect illustration of my judgment call out. There's so much judgment. I mean, even like for me, so I went first and then like I just felt like, oh my gosh, like I said I said 1,000 to donation and I'm like, oh, everyone's going higher than me. Am I just like miserly? I don't think I am. But anyway, yeah, so it's just I feel like it's a very interesting illustration of just like
right,
the
right.
yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna get $5,000 in $1 bills, and I'm gonna get them, and I'm gonna put it in a suitcase for me
Oh my
Oh
god, Susan.
man.
and hold
This
it.
is
No, because do you know what I mean? Like, do you
what
ever
if you're
feel?
Do you guys want to hear a really sad story?
Wait.
Okay.
Oh,
Kate,
is this
Finish.
have to do with somebody putting money and then the house
Kate,
burned down?
wait,
Okay,
no,
No,
wait,
okay, okay.
wait,
finish
no,
your
wait.
story, Susan.
Okay, wait, no, Kate, you do the thing where you scream so loud,
Oh,
and
I'm
then
sorry,
it
sorry,
cuts
sorry, sorry.
out. So
Sorry.
wait,
Oh,
what did you just say?
I said, "What if your house burns down?
Okay,
Then
that
you
would
lose
really
all the
suck.
money."
I know. I just want to just hold the money and I want to
Okay.
throw it in the
You
air
wanna
and I want to
swim through
swim
it? Yeah,
around
swim through
like
it
Oh,
like
like
yeah,
the
yeah, that duck.
Scrooge
Yeah.
guy. Yeah, the duck guy. And I just want to feel wealthy.
okay,
Like I
cool.
just don't ever feel that way. And I just want to just do that.
Okay. Can we come over and
Maybe.
record it?
I think Susan, you need to put $5,000 into self-care. I'm aligned on that part.
Okay. All right. Anyway. All right, Jan, what's your awful story to wrap us up?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know. I feel like this is maybe too sad to share. But one of the things I also kept a lot of my elementary school journals. And I was reading through them like a couple years ago, and I think the teacher's prompt was like, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Sorry, this relates to a lot of like my adult angst and issues. But like I might just cut this out of the podcast, but I'll just tell you guys. The thing that I wrote is not a career, but I said I want a train full of money. Like, and I literally drew a train with like dollar bills like like filled to the brim and coming out. And I wasn't even that into buying things, but I think that was my mindset. Like that's what I want to do. It wasn't even like I wasn't even thinking about what do I enjoy doing, like what do I want to do? Like I just want to have money. Like I want to have enough money.
A train full.
Yeah, a train full. And so sometimes Jake talks about he's like, maybe we should like actually get like a cargo train like thing and like fill it with like dollar bills and you can like jump in it or something.
Possible.
Yes.
Totally
Yeah, it's
possible.
everything is so digital these days that it's hard to, even if the numbers say that you're wealthy, it's hard to like grasp it because there's no physical manifestation to it. I mean, Susan, to your aspect, yeah, I think we all want to dive into a pile of money to experience that.
Clean money, never been touched.
I was just about to say not me if it's really
No, clean looked. All right. Anyways,
okay.
Shun, thanks so much for joining us
Of
on the
course.
podcast today. I learned so much that wealth is a mindset and I need to definitely change mine. And, wishing you all the best with your book. And if people want to stay in touch with you and learn about your courses and all that jazz, where can they find you?
Save my cent, as in cents and dollars, on Instagram is my main deal. But you can also find me on Save My Cents and I think we can leave a couple links in the show notes. Yeah.
Sure. And your book is
Um,
going to be available on Amazon, and where can they find your
Everywhere.
book?
Yeah, Amazon, Barnes& and Noble's bookshop, local independent bookstores. Bookshop supports those independent bookstores as well. So available everywhere.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Shang.
Amazing. Thanks for your time. And
Thank
that's
you.
it for Model Minority Moms.
We hope you found something helpful, reassuring, or interesting in this episode of Model Minority Moms. If you enjoyed the episode, please help us spread the word by texting a friend about our show or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to connect with us, please visit our website at modelminoritymoms.com or follow us on Instagram, where we love receiving messages from our listeners.